Prerequisites of probability. The following concept is discussed as the prerequisites of probability. Experimental probability. Experimental probability is found by repeating an experiment and observing the outcomes or results. Now let's do an experiment and observe outcomes. Let's take a coin, toss it 6 times and note down the number of times a head or a tail comes up. If tossed a coin on a plane surface, result should be either tail or head. Here we should toss on plane surface only because the coin can only land in one of two possible ways, that is either heads up or tails up, but there is possibility of its landing on its edge, which may be possible, for example, if it falls on sand. So that is the reason tossing a coin should be on plane surface only. Let's record the observations in a table. The observations of tossing a coin are recorded. After completion of 6 experiments, note down in a table that number of times coin tossed, number of times heads comes up, and number of times tails comes up. Here in the experiment, heads comes 2 times, tails comes 4 times. Now find out the value of number of times the head or tail coming up, from the total number of times the coin was tossed, using the fractions. Now probability of heads is equals to number of times the heads comes up divided by the total number of times the coin was tossed. Now probability of tails is equals to number of times the tail comes up divided by the total number of times the coin was tossed. Now toss the coin 20 times, and in the same way, record the observations as in the previous table. Again find the values of the fractions given previously for this collection of observations. Repeat the same experiment, by increasing the number of times, 50, 100, 1000 and so on, and record the number of heads and tails. Then find the values of the corresponding fractions. We will find that as the number of tosses gets larger, the values of the fractions come closer to 0.5. Let's know some basic terminology of probability, by considering the terminology used in tossing coin experiment. Here each toss of a coin is called a trial. Outcome. It is a possible result of an experiment. When you toss a coin, there are 2 possible outcomes, heads or tails. So, a trial is an action which results in one or several outcomes. An event is some specified result that may or may not occur when an experiment is performed. So we can say that an event is also one kind of an outcome. For example, in an experiment of tossing a coin once, the coin landing with heads facing up is an event, since it may or may not occur. Let's now see what do we mean by experimental probability. Based on what we directly observed as the outcomes of our trials, we find the experimental or empirical probability, POV of an event happening, is given by POV equals number of trails in which the event happened divided by the total number of trails. Here experimental probability is found by repeating an experiment and observing the outcomes, or P of event equals number of times event occurs divided by total number of trails. Here, we are calculating probabilities based on the results of an actual experiment. For this reason, they are called experimental or empirical probabilities. For example, consider the tossing coin experiment. If we do that experiment for 1000 trials, consider that tails came for 545 times, and heads came for 455 times. Now let's calculate the experimental probability using the formula. Experimental probability, that is, P of event equals number of times event occurs divided by total number of trails. Here, experiment is done 1000 times, in that 455 times head occurs, and 545 times tail occurs. Event heads comes up, that is, P of H equals 455 divided by 1000. So probability of heads is equals 0.455. Similarly we can find the probability of tails. Event tails comes up, that is, P of T equals 545 divided by 1000. So probability of tails is equals 0.545. After completion of 1000 experiments, note down in a table that number of times coin tossed, number of times head comes up, and number of times tail comes up. Here in our experiment, head comes 455 times, tail comes 545 times. So the probability of heads is 0.455 and the probability of tails is 0.545.